(1983) began with Margaret Thatcher's first visit to the Falkland Islands since the end of the war. Her first stop was at the airbase at RAF Stanley. The old tarmac runway had been completely covered and lengthened to make it suitable for Phantoms and Hercules transport planes. From the roof of the control tower, the Prime Minister watched Phantoms take off on one of their regular patrols around the islands.
The Phantoms share responsibility for aerial defence with the RAF Harriers. Most of these planes are the ones which took part in the combat over the islands during the conflict.
Lieutenant Grimsley.
How long have you been here? It's a very exciting mission.
Has it, Velvet?
Well,
It can be.
A short distance from the airport, she was shown the work going on to prepare a site for the floating hotel, which will be gently floated into place once access to the site has been prepared.
And there's about another 13,000 tons of rock gone into place.
Later, as is the style in the Falklands, the weather changed abruptly. The clear skies and sunshine had gone as the Prime Minister was flown to see some of the beach areas which were heavily mined by the Argentines and which now have to be fenced off. There are about 100 square miles of countryside around Stanley which are still too dangerous to enter. For Mrs. Thatcher's inspection, a safe corridor had been carefully prepared onto the beach.
The next day, and Mrs. Thatcher arrived in Fitzroy. Stepping in across the moorland, there was autograph signing, though some confusion about which day it was.
now, is it the 10th or the 11th? I don't know.
10th.
The 10th.
That's right.
An artillery battery showed how it could fire off its guns, and then the Prime Minister was invited to have a go, remained in the San Carlos cemetery rather than be brought home. With Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, who directed the task force operations from London, at her side, the Prime Minister walked slowly into the small plot to lay her wreath at the foot of a plain wooden cross.
Thousands of migrant workers poured out of Nigeria. The government, under pressure because of growing unemployment, had ordered all foreign workers to leave by the end of the month.
Tens of thousands of refugees, mostly Ghanaians, amassed here at the border of the two tiny West African states of Benin and Togo. The road home to Ghana has come to a standstill, hopelessly clogged with vehicles and a seething mass of refugees, while the frontier remains temporarily closed. Within minutes of the frontier reopening, there was chaos. Not even the sticks and flails of authority could deter these West Africans from crossing over. Many families had been waiting 10 days to walk the 50 yards or so from Benin into Togo. They'd run out of food, living on just coconuts, and now they'd run out of patience too. It'll take several days, perhaps weeks, for all the refugees to reach their home countries. The traffic jam at the frontiers are now many miles long.
Also in January, the tennis star Bjorn Borg announced he was retiring at 26. At the time, the Wimbledon champion was angry at new rules requiring players to qualify for the big tournaments.
I think if a player wants to take a long rest from tennis, get away for quite a time, or if a player gets injured for a long time, why should he be punished? I don't think that's fair.
It ended a decade at the top in which he won every major tournament except the US Open. It was to be another 8 years before Borg attempted a comeback with little success. Another loss to the sporting world in February when Shergar, the brilliant Derby winner, was stolen from the Aga Khan stud farm in Ireland. The beautiful bay with the white blaze was said to be one of the most valuable horses in the world. Kidnappers demanded £2 million for his safe return. Despite newspaper reports of sightings, most people feared he'd died. Also in February, the mass murderer Dennis Nielsen was charged after plumbers calling to investigate blocked drains at his London home discovered mutilated human remains. Within days, Nielsen had confessed to 15 or 16 gruesome murders over a period of 4 years, 3 at his Muswell Hill flat and about 13 at his previous address in Cricklewood. He told police to search the garden at the back of 195 Melrose Avenue for evidence.
A large part of the rear garden has now been completely screened, with scaffolding erected overnight and covered with a blue tarpaulin. Beneath, small white covers can just be seen, though it's not clear whether they mark any particularly significant areas. A Scotland Yard spokesman told me what kind of operation the police would be conducting.
There will eventually be some searching and digging of the premises.
A few minutes ago, a police van suddenly drew up outside the house and a squad of half a dozen officers equipped with spades, sieves and other digging implements hurried down the side passage to the back garden. Underneath the plastic sheeting, detectives have now divided the area into squares. Uniformed officers with dogs have also arrived and have begun work.
Nielsen was later found guilty of 6 murders. The judge at his trial sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve at least 25 years.
Come on, move back.
On a lighter note in February, the Queen made her first visit to Hollywood. She and the Duke of Edinburgh were met at a special all-star extravaganza in her honour by Mrs. Nancy Reagan, standing in for her husband. All the stars turned out to catch a glimpse of the royal couple. Among them, many famous faces from Britain, celebrities now settled in California after making their careers in the Hollywood film and music industry.
Well, she's a great lady. She does a wonderful job. Guess that's it.
The show was hosted by the American television personality Ed McMahon, and the first performer was the comedian George Burns. He said he'd been warming up for the act for 60 years.
And they're talking about making a movie of my life. Hope they do it fast so I could see it. There's only one thing holding it up. They're waiting for some actor to get old enough to play me.
Afterwards, the Queen thanked all those who had taken part in the entertainments. She'd clearly enjoyed her evening. The royal flavour of the year continued into March, this time the Prince and Princess of Wales on their travels to Australia. And with them, although briefly, Prince William, just 9 months old. Gently carried by his nanny, Barbara Barnes, the baby prince looked decidedly confused at being roused from the royal cot in the middle of his night into the dazzling sun of an Australian morning. Prince William was to be flown a further 500 miles to stay at the royal retreat in the outback, where he was to spend most of his time in Australia.
The start of her first day of royal duties abroad, and for the Princess of Wales an opportunity to meet the children of Alice Springs in person, and also the children of Australia on the airwaves. With Prince Charles, she was visiting the Royal Flying Doctor Service's School of the Air, where they were to broadcast to some 16,000 children in the outback.
Now for all of our students on air today, good morning, girls and boys.
Questions about Prince William dominated the broadcast, carefully listened to by thousands more children in the sunshine outside.
Does Prince William have a favourite toy?
Jamie, he loves his koala bear he's got. But he hasn't got anything particular. He just likes something with a bit of noise.
Plastic whale which throws things out.
He got a plastic whale that throws things out the top, little balls.
Thank you. Jamie, I hope that answers your question.
In the afternoon, a sightseeing excursion to a rock, Australia's own wonderland near Alice, Ayers Rock. The world's greatest monolith dominates the desert landscape. It was to the foot of the rock that the Aborigines and their chiefs came to pay homage to the prince and princess from faraway England. The Aborigines are the owners of the rock, and so they invited the royal visitors to attempt the tortuous climb to the top. The tour organizers and security men below were aghast. 12 people have died on the rock. However, both prince and princess displayed remarkable agility on the slopes made slippery by recent rains. There wasn't time, though, to reach the summit. They came down to take up a vantage point and witness the scarlet glory of a sunset at Ayers Rock.
High above any sunset would lie a new space-based nuclear defense system, which was to become known as Star Wars. President Reagan announced in March plans to build a missile shield across America. Involving years of research, it would lead to satellites and lasers able to home in on and destroy enemy nuclear warheads.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles.
In April, the German magazine Stern published extracts from Hitler's secret diaries. Although the diaries were later found to be fakes, cheap school exercise books crudely aged with cold tea, Stern claimed their authenticity had been thoroughly checked.
Stern called the press conference, bringing many of the handwriting specialists and historians of the Nazi period to answer wide-ranging doubts. Reporter Heidemann said he unraveled the mystery by following the last flight of Junkers 352. It left Berlin only days before Hitler's suicide on the direct orders of the dictator, who was desperate his personal record be saved for history. Heidemann found the crash site in East Germany, even found remains of the plane, the pilot's grave, and contrary to learned opinion, discovered that a safe carrying the diaries had survived the crash. The rest he won't explain, saying his information comes from people behind the Iron Curtain who would be at risk, and from Nazi survivors in South America. Stern management denied any possibility of error, saying experts examined handwriting, age of paper, type of ink, and alluded that experts expressing doubt were upset they hadn't been involved.
For all the questions of authenticity, each and every expert who has viewed these diaries, whether in the field of handwriting or history, has agreed they are the works of Hitler. The doubts are being raised by experts who have not seen the documents.
But the British historian Lord Dacre, who had seen the diaries, was beginning to have doubts.
I regret that the normal method of historical verification has perhaps necessarily been, to some extent, sacrificed to the requirements of a journalistic scoop.
The journalist and convicted forger behind the diaries were later imprisoned for fraud. There was nothing fake about the stars turning out for the annual Oscar ceremony. Raquel Welch, the veteran American actor, Mickey Rooney, Jack Lemmon, Dustin Hoffman, all with hopes of an award. But it was a British film, Gandhi, which stole the show, winning 8 Oscars, including Best Film. Ben Kingsley, who played Gandhi, won Best Actor. He rejected suggestions that he'd had to assume Gandhi's personality in order to portray him.
My limits on my work are very, very strict. I'm a storyteller. I stick strictly within that frame. I don't really indulge in any bizarre psychological exercises. So no, it was my job to share Gandhi with you, but never to become him, no.
Liz?
Mr. Kingsley, do you remember when I interviewed you in New York and I told you how sexy I thought you were in Gandhi, and you said that you liked that very much? That was another dimension to the picture. You feeling sexy tonight?
Would you like me to answer that now, or shall we talk about it later?
Work started in May to divert a flow of red-hot lava from Italy's Mount Etna. It was feared villagers lying in its path would be destroyed.
Engineers have bored a hole in the side of the dike which the lava has thrown up for itself and inserted a long steel tube. The idea is to use it as a chute to deliver explosives deep into the dike wall and breach it, setting free the stream of red-hot lava which, they hope, will be directed down a different part of the mountain by a series of dams of volcanic rubble. This is the head of the finger of lava that's been advancing in a very slow...
There was nothing fake about the stars turning out for the annual Oscar ceremony. Raquel Welch, the veteran American actor, Mickey Rooney, Jack Lemmon, Dustin Hoffman, all with hopes of an award. But it was a British film, Gandhi, which stole the show, winning 8 Oscars, including Best Film. Ben Kingsley, who played Gandhi, won Best Actor. He rejected suggestions that he'd had to assume Gandhi's personality in order to portray him.
My limits on my work are very, very strict. I'm a storyteller. I stick strictly within that frame. I don't really indulge in any bizarre psychological exercises. So no, it was my job to share Gandhi with you, but never to become him, no.
Liz?
Mr. Kingsley, do you remember when I interviewed you in New York and I told you how sexy I thought you were in Gandhi, and you said that you liked that very much? That was another dimension to the picture. You feeling sexy tonight?
Would you like me to answer that now, or shall we talk about it later?
Work started in May to divert a flow of red-hot lava from Italy's Mount Etna. It was feared villagers lying in its path would be destroyed.
Engineers have bored a hole in the side of the dike which the lava has thrown up for itself and inserted a long steel tube. The idea is to use it as a chute to deliver explosives deep into the dike wall and breach it, setting free the stream of red-hot lava which, they hope, will be directed down a different part of the mountain by a series of dams of volcanic rubble. This is the head of the finger of lava that's been advancing in a very slow-motion avalanche down the mountainside for weeks towards the towns and villages below. For the moment, it's come to a halt, a great pile of cinders and boulders that will remain here now forever as part of the countryside. But it could set off again because the source, the red-hot lava high on the mountain, is still flowing, and the Italians have not yet abandoned their plans to divert it. The anxious residents of 3 large villages below the lava have made it plain at a public meeting that they want the diversion attempt to be made as soon as possible. But now the authorities are wavering. They're under attack from academics at the University of Catania, who say that the series of fractures in the mountainside from which the lava is flowing is too vulnerable, and that the explosion could trigger a catastrophic eruption.
Big tremors at Westminster, where the dissolution of Parliament was announced and a general election called.
By the Queen, a proclamation dissolving the present Parliament and declaring the calling of another.
By this time, party leaders were already on the move. Mrs. Thatcher left to make her first big speech. With the dissolution of Parliament, MPs become ordinary citizens. They're locked out of their offices. They can't use House of Commons notepaper for letters, and they get only a one-way railway ticket back home. While they were on their way, election writs were being posted to every constituency. Although the election speeches and arguments have already started and the posters will begin appearing all over the country this weekend, the Tories are holding back their main campaign. The Labour and Alliance parties, who want to make the most of their time, begin holding their national news conferences next Monday, and their manifestos will be published.
June the 9th, election day, the Prime Minister was the first party leader to vote.
Mrs. Thatcher went on to North London. Her son Mark was with her, and Mr. Thatcher again. On polling day, the chat has to be non-political. That being the case, Mr. Thatcher chose to ask what time the pubs opened, for the press's benefit, of course.
Waiting for a beer.
The Labour leader is spending the day in his South Wales constituency, formerly Ebbw Vale, now called Blaenau Gwent. He's already cast his vote by post. It hasn't altogether been Mr. Foot's day so far. First, the local newspaper shop didn't have any guardians, and then he found he was too early to get into the local park. The gates were still chained up. Later, he made a tour of the polling stations in his constituency to see how things were going. He refused to be drawn into predictions about the result, preferring to wait for the real thing.
In the central Glasgow constituency of Hill Head, Mr. Roy Jenkins walked from his flat to the polling station. There are 7 candidates standing in Hill Head, as well as Alliance, Tory, Labour and Scottish National. There's an independent Conservative, a candidate for animal rights and anti-vivisection, and the Ecology Party. Roy Jenkins is defending a majority of just over 2,000. But since that by-election, there have been significant boundary changes. As he cast his vote this morning, he had some delight in the fact that it's the first time in 14 elections that, by living in the constituency he's fighting, he's been eligible to vote for himself.
The Steel Camp had considered matching the Prime Minister's 7:15 sortie, but decided on letting their leader get a little bit extra sleep, and it was almost 8:45 when Mr. Steele exercised his franchise. I asked him how he'd voted.
Anyway, I'll tell you who I voted for. It's a secret ballot.
Voted for the
I don't think I needed a tactical vote here.
He'll spend the rest of the day resting, but will visit all the polling places in the constituency before 10 p.m. It will be after midnight before he goes to his own count.
Counting over, and the Conservatives back in power with a landslide victory, an overall Tory majority of 144. Mrs. Thatcher became the first Prime Minister for more than 30 years to gain re-election after a full term in office. She set about deciding her cabinet, which, as she explained to Robin Day, was no easy task.
What you have to do is that you've had a number of people in the House for quite a time. You've had a number of people in junior posts. You know, people who are climbing the ladder want to be able to climb up another rung. The terrifying thing and frightening thing for me, it's the worst job I ever have to do here, is that means having to, if some people are to come on the ladder, some people have to climb off. And it's not because they've done the job badly at all. It is because you have to keep movement in politics in order to keep people with something to go for.
I think it was Asquith who said, perhaps in this very building, that a Prime Minister must be a good butcher. Are you a good butcher, Mrs. Thatcher?
No, I'm not a good butcher, but I've had to learn to carve the joint.
Whilst it had now been decided that Mrs. Thatcher was staying put in Downing Street, the Prince and Princess of Wales were on the move again, this time to Canada, and this time without Prince William, who'd been left behind at Kensington Palace. The Prince told the Canadians he'd come to show them his new wife.
The couple have 18 days in Canada ahead of them. 6 provinces to visit, parades and speeches and guards of honor in all of them. It's the Prince of Wales who takes the leading part in these ceremonies, but it's the Princess, looking on, who's at the center of public attention. Canadians expect them to return one day as King and Queen of Canada. And part of Prince Charles's mission this time is to introduce her to Canadians. This he began in Halifax today.
And now we have come back, and I have an opportunity to introduce my wife to a large number of Canadians.
The royal couple's visit to Canada coincided with Prince William's first birthday. On the actual day, they were in Ottawa, where they discovered the event had not passed unnoticed, despite the usual official engagements.
most unusual photograph.
No doubt a round of civic engagements here is not the way the royal couple would have preferred to spend their son's first birthday, but they had little choice in the matter. And what happened, in fact, was that the whole city joined in a sort of birthday party from afar. The banners were up on a big block of flats, tributes to the princess as well as to her son. And as ever, she was overwhelmed with presents for him. By the time she is finished, if she takes them all home, the Britannia will look like a toy shop.
Next stop, Edmonton in the province of Alberta, and the Prince and Princess of Wales were required to dress for the occasion, a visit to a reconstructed 19th century gold rush town.
The Prince went as the Prince of Wales in 1860, the Princess as a lady of quality of the same era in a dress modelled on royal heirlooms. The courtiers went in costume too. Even the Scotland Yard detectives were got up as gamblers. The whole effect, enhanced by a horse-drawn carriage ride through a reconstructed 19th century town, was described by one of the royal household as upmarket gold rush. The waving townspeople were genuine, even if Edmonton never really was a gold town at all, except perhaps for the black gold of oil.
The Pope was on his travels in June as well, his second trip to Poland, his native land, since becoming Pope. After his first visit, solidarity was born. Now he came to offer his support to Poles living under the oppression of martial law.
This morning, as he offered the people his solidarity, the government offered a thinly disguised attack. Without naming the Pope, a government minister warned against giving young people myths, legends and half-truths. John Paul II, it seemed, has touched a raw nerve in the capital, so have the crowds and the banners. Today, he told them, there are many in Poland who hunger and thirst for justice. I bring you my solidarity and that of the Church. What the Pope may not have seen in Wrocław was the tight police security, the largest concentration of riot units since the tour began. Later, they were reported briefly in action, containing some 200 demonstrators, supporters of solidarity. This was the first reported incident of its kind. Up till now, the police had kept a low profile, leaving discipline to the Church. The other major figure in the Pope's visit, Lech Wałęsa, today got the news he'd been waiting for. He was granted 3 days leave from the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. He'll see the Pope on Thursday. Last night, Wałęsa tried to test his freedom. He gave his police escort the slip. This morning, though, they were back with him. This afternoon, Pope John Paul travelled to St. Anna's Mount in southern Poland, a centre for religious pilgrimages. The workers there have a reputation for being tough and obstinate. Today, the Pope held them in his hands. The Pope's message will have struck a chord with these people, the constant pointed theme, trade union freedom and the defence of human rights.
At the end of the month, America's first woman in space returned home safely in the Space Shuttle Challenger. Sally Ride, a 32-year-old physicist, was one of 5 astronauts aboard the shuttle for the almost flawless 6-day flight.
After banking sharply, Challenger glided in for its final approach to the dry lake bed at the Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert. The landing had been thirsty work.
Congratulations, a great-looking landing. The good news is the beer is very, very cold this morning. The bad news is it's 3,000 miles away. That's what I was afraid of.
After the landing today, the 5 astronauts emerged looking remarkably relaxed. It wasn't the usual style homecoming. The official welcoming party was on the other side of the continent. But at least President Reagan managed to speak to them.
Welcome home. Thank you very much, sir. And now this is the second time. You know, I was going to meet you in Florida, but then you decided to land in California. But again, you didn't stop and pick me up off the South Lawn like I asked you to. I'm guilty, sir.
There was a specially warm welcome from the crowd for Sally Ride.
It was fun, and in fact, I'm sure it's the most fun I'll ever have in my life.
From the latest space technology to a dinosaur's claw, hundreds of millions of years old. Bill Walker, a plumber and amateur fossil hunter from Surrey, described how he found the claw.
I found a rock nodule with that claw in it, but only a very little bit of it showing, just this end there was showing.
Now you hit it with a hammer, didn't you?
Yes, primarily to break the rock away to see what was in there. And the whole thing just disintegrated, claw as well. And I could have cried.
But the Natural History Museum managed to glue the bits together, and their experts went to work on the clay pit. Embedded in ironstone, they recovered the remains of the skeleton, 3 van loads of it. Team leader Dr. Alan Charig used an American replica with which to compare jawbone and teeth of the Surrey dinosaur.
And this seems to be of much the same order of size. If you compare this piece of the lower jaw with a corresponding piece of the American animal, you'll see that our animal is perhaps a little larger.
There were developments in Poland in July with the lifting of martial law. Martial law had been imposed by the country's leader, General Jaruzelski, in 1981 to crack down on Solidarity, the free trade union movement. Now Jaruzelski wanted to prove to the West that Poland was returning to normal. But many of the tough new civil laws were not that different from the old martial law regulations, and life was not expected to improve much for the Poles. The new Soviet ambassador arrived to monitor the government's progress in keeping down strikes and demonstrations. Bernardo Aquino, the Philippines opposition leader, was assassinated at Manila Airport. He always knew he was at risk.
I suppose there's a physical danger because, assassination is part of public service.
Soon after the China Airlines plane landed, 3 uniformed officers came aboard and escorted Aquino to the exit. Reporters and cameramen were barred from getting off. Seconds later, the shooting began. The government account of the shooting says this man is Aquino's killer. Escorting officers, according to the government version, returned fire, killing the man. Some on the plane watching from windows said they thought the officers accompanying Aquino shot him, but could not be sure. Pandemonium broke out at the airport as word of the shooting spread. Within hours, President Marcos issued a strong statement condemning the killing. One opposition leader said, "Now isn't the time to speculate who's responsible. We must bury him first."
Another tragedy in September with the shooting down by Soviet fighters of a Korean Airlines jumbo jet. All 269 people on the flight from New York to Seoul died. The Soviet Union first claimed the plane was on a spy mission and then said it was flying without lights, but America said it was a deliberate attack.
Japanese controllers spotted the Russian fighters on their long-range military radar. There's no doubt American forces based in Japan were getting the same picture. The aircraft called Tokyo with a routine request to climb 11 minutes before being destroyed. At that time, it was well inside Russian airspace, with Sukhoi Flagon interceptors flying alongside. Yet Tokyo Control didn't mention it to the captain. In Britain, the RAF intercept Russian military planes in international airspace 4 or 5 times a week. The Phantoms are fully armed, but pilots know that the authority to use weapons in peacetime would have to come from the Prime Minister and nobody else. If an unidentified civil aircraft penetrated Britain's airspace, pilots would try to shepherd it out or to lead it to an airfield. It's inconceivable that an airliner identified as such and likely to be carrying passengers would ever be shot down. And in Britain, military and civilian air traffic controllers work alongside each other at centres like West Drayton. That system is designed to prevent confusion or mistakes. If Japan had operated the same way, this tragedy might not have happened.
Here's a brief segment of the tape, which we're going to play in its entirety for the United Nations Security Council tomorrow. Those were the voices of the Soviet pilots. In this tape, the pilot who fired the missile describes his search for what he calls the target. He reports he has it in sight Indeed, he pulls up to within about a mile of the Korean plane, mentions its flashing strobe light and that its navigation lights are on. He then reports he's reducing speed to get behind the airliner, gives his distance from the plane at various points in this maneuver, and finally announces what can only be called the Korean airline massacre.
The sealed wooden boxes containing all that's been found of the airliner will be the centerpiece of the formal investigation. The Japanese Maritime Safety Agency, which retrieved as much as it could from international waters, loaded them aboard a special Korean airline plane sent to fetch them, and some wreckage retrieved by the Soviet Union. The personal belongings of the passengers, still unclaimed, have been put on display in a small room in Sapporo, so much flotsam thrown up by the sea. Flowers from local officials and Korean airlines, which have been placed on the white drapes, cannot take away the harshness of the finds. Shoes which have been snapped in half, other objects which have been charred or torn. Many who've come have gone away in tears. By Japanese law, personal effects recovered from an accident at sea have to be held for 6 months. Until that time limit is passed, this sad little display will remain in place.
In Northern Ireland in September, police and security forces began a huge province-wide search, following a mass breakout from the Maze prison near Lisbon, a few miles from Belfast. 38 IRA prisoners escaped. One prison officer, James Ferris, who suffered from a heart complaint, died after being stabbed during the breakout.
Helicopters and dogs were called in as the search spread from the area immediately around the Maze prison to the whole of the province. Security forces in the Irish Republic have also been patrolling their side of the border, should any of the men on the run be heading south. The whole operation is being monitored minute by minute at the Royal Ulster Constabulary's Force Control Centre at their Belfast headquarters. By telephone and a special radio network, senior officers are in constant contact with every RUC post in Northern Ireland. A computer monitors police operations in the Belfast area. The centre also catalogues Northern Ireland's violence. The latest to die, prison officer James Ferris, stabbed to death during yesterday's mass breakout. It was into this control room this morning that the first reports came that 2 of the escaped Maze prisoners had been picked up by the police in Castlewellan in County Down. If any more of the escaped prisoners are spotted, it's from here that the operation to recapture them will be coordinated. At the Maze, detectives have been trying to find out exactly what happened. The Reverend Ian Paisley called on the Northern Ireland Secretary James Pryor. He said he'd told Mr. Pryor about a serious security breach.
The amazing thing is the admission that the outer gate of the prison was open. And that's a very serious admission. And why was it opened at that particular time? And who was responsible for leaving it open? And that is a matter that must be thoroughly searched into.
Are you convinced in your own mind that there was some kind of inside collusion?
There could. We put to him the question, could these prisoners bring in all these weapons through visits? And he said, well, it might be, but practically it would be impossible.
Mr. Pryor was adamant that it was too soon to make snap judgments about inside jobs.
Well, all these things will need to be looked at, but I think it's very easy for people outside to say what they think may have gone wrong.
Mr. Pryor has ordered an urgent and full inquiry, which will be carried out by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Sir James Hennessy.
A sporting triumph for Australia at the end of the month. Alan Bond's Australia 2 snatched the prestigious America's Cup yachting trophy from the Americans. The trophy had been held by the United States since 1851. But this year's defender, the red-hulled Liberty, proved no match for the Aussie crew. Supporters, both at the finishing line in Newport, Rhode Island and back home in Australia, were ecstatic.
The setting was grand, a marble mansion built for one of the yacht racing Vanderbilts now long dead. There it was, the America's Cup, safely unscrewed from its plinth in the New York Yacht Club and meeting its new masters already.
This is the boat that's kept the cup in place for 132 years.
This is the greatest thing you could do for our country, Australia.
Then the moment Alan Bond had waited 12 years for, a chance to flourish the cup before taking it back to Perth for at least 4 years. The applause was polite, the manners impeccable, but it all lacked spirit. A starchy occasion, far different from the liveliest celebrations last night when the victorious Australians and their fans took over Newport until the small hours. A summer of racing has left Newport with half a dozen unwanted 12-metre yachts. Liberty will probably be used for trials in 1988, but the others aren't needed. The big draw here remains Australia 2's Wing Keel. But within 48 hours, this boat too will be crated up and sent back to a hero's welcome.
That welcome's been gathering steam in Australia since their yacht crossed the finish 41 seconds ahead. Prime Minister Bob Hawke was showered with champagne and congratulations as he arrived at Australia 2's home club in Perth, and he expressed all their feelings.
There's not many occasions when an Australian Prime Minister knows that he can speak for every Australian, but on this occasion, you sure can. You speak, Bondi and all of you there, we say, well done, congratulations. I don't think there's been a greater moment of pride for Australia than in what you've done.
Great pride too for Neil Kinnock. In October, he was elected leader of the Labour Party by an overwhelming majority of the party's electoral college votes. Roy Hattersley had a comfortable win for the post of Mr. Kinnock's deputy. Mr. Kinnock pledged to lead his party into office, saying, "I know the magnitude of my task." As one politician gained office, another lost it. Cecil Parkinson resigned as Trade and Industry Secretary after his pregnant mistress, Sarah Keyes, made their affair public. At first, Mr. Parkinson refused to speculate on his future.
I've no idea.
And his wife was equally reticent.
No, I cannot. I have no further comments to make now or at any other time.
The Prime Minister, too, would say nothing. Mrs. Thatcher's made it clear she regards this essentially as a private matter. Sarah Keyes herself, seen here in a karate championship 13 years ago, also said nothing.
But there was no holding back in Poland for the Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa. He'd just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his massive personal effort in trying to win workers the right to a free trade union.
Wałęsa said the award wouldn't affect either his way of life or his struggle for free trade unions in Poland. He said the prize money, about £140,000, would go to the Roman Catholic Church. The Polish government haven't yet said whether they'll allow him to leave Poland to collect the award, but it's thought he may decide anyway to send a relative or his wife Danuta.
On a more somber note, the actor Sir Ralph Richardson died. He was 80.
Ralph Richardson, in such a long career, was asked to look back many times. His comment on such a variety of roles was, "I don't mind how small a part is, so long as it's interesting." His theatrical experience began at 18, painting the scenery at Brighton Repertory Theatre. Success as an actor followed swiftly, but he reached a wider audience in an impressively long and varied career in the cinema. He shared friendship, success and work with Lord Olivier and Sir John Gielgud. Tonight, another actor and friend paid tribute to him.
He will be quite irreplaceable, and very, very sadly missed by thousands of people who knew him and loved him.
In his 70s, Sir Ralph was always working. A very private man in his private life, he developed a delightfully idiosyncratic style in public and frequently arrived for appointments on a powerful motorbike. He was once described as a large, eloquent version of a very ordinary man, and he confessed to always having stage fright.
Always, yes. It's necessary, rather, to concentrate. Always very nervous.
Yes.
It's necessary. You have to dream the part, you know. Some of it must be true to you. You have to really believe it's happening. And it does take a good deal of concentration to do that successfully. It must be real to you in some ways.
In Israel, Yitzhak Shamir was confirmed as the country's prime minister. He'd had to win the votes of the minority parties to gain power.
Mr. Shamir made his plea for power against a background of internal crisis that was mounting by the hour. What little confidence there was in Israel's currency was rapidly vanishing, and the concern expressed inside the Knesset was as nothing compared to the panic outside. But before he could scrape together enough votes to give him power, Mr. Shamir had to indulge in some remarkable political horse trading. He needed the votes of the tiny ultra-religious parties who have little support in Israel, but are guaranteed seats under the proportional representation voting system. They objected, for example, to the building of a mixed swimming pool in Jerusalem close to one of their educational establishments. Mr. Shamir, with his country sinking into ever deeper crisis, had to agree to try and stop work on the pool once in power.
It was that sort of issue that in the end determined Mr. Shamir's success in taking over one of the hottest political seats in the world. But now he's in that seat, he has to try and sort out an internal crisis that threatens Israel as much as any external enemy has ever done.
Financial crises are nothing new to Israel, with inflation around 130%. But the past week has seen a total collapse in what little confidence there was in the Israeli shekel. The stock exchange was closed yesterday and today, and again there was panic selling of shekels. The government denied that there was to be a devaluation. Then they devalued. But it may only be a stopgap. Even if he can shore up the economy, Mr. Shamir still has to cope with, amongst other problems, an increasingly unpopular Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon that's costing the country $1 million a day. He can't afford to let that continue financially or politically. Equally, he can't afford to pull out either, given his tenuous hold on power.
Still in the Middle East, Beirut, where 241 American Marines and 58 French paratroopers died after suicide bombers drove trucks filled with explosives into the headquarters of the French and American peacekeeping forces. Rescue work continued throughout the day with drills, bulldozers, and bare hands as soldiers searched desperately for any survivors. Fanatical Shia Muslims were thought to have been responsible. The American Marine commander, General P.X. Kelly, traveled to Germany to visit some of the men injured in the attack. He awarded them the Purple Heart, the U.S. Army's top decoration for soldiers wounded in action.
The harrowing search is finally over. The last of the bodies of the U.S. Marines dug out from beneath hundreds of tons of concrete. The devastation at the scene of the greatest loss of life by American forces since the Vietnam War. After the Beirut massacre, the soldiers of the multinational peacekeeping force try to forget. But despite appearances, those Marines who survived the suicide bomb attack are still in a state of shock. British soldiers had helped them search the ruins for the injured and the dead. Now the Americans were invited to a barbecue at the British headquarters in a gesture of compassion and friendship. The cooperation is evident on the streets too. American diplomats also work at the British Embassy, since their own building was destroyed in a similar bomb attack last April. The British troops are particularly vulnerable, billeted right in the firing line between all the warring factions. The headquarters, a prime target for attack, have so far been left alone. But after the bomb outrages, no chances are being taken.
We've put lots of soil, we're building new blast walls, we're building, as you have seen, new protection, we've increased the number of sentries. I'm confident that it would be extremely difficult for us to be hit in a similar way to the way that the Americans and the French were hit last Sunday.
America awoke just 2 days later to discover its troops were seizing control of Grenada, a tiny island in the Caribbean. Grenada's neighbors had urged America to intervene after the Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, was arrested by the island's military commander, backed, it was thought, by Cuba. The Bishop was later found dead. The Governor-General, Sir Paul Scoon, also requested help.
Inside this house, the Governor-General was forced to take shelter and lie on the floor when hostile militia shelled it at the start of the invasion.
The army will be called up in due course. The men will be asked to lay down their arms. And it may be, in fact, it will be necessary to abolish the army.
Not surprisingly, in such a tiny island, the presence of nearly 6,000 American troops is something that you can't miss. They certainly stick out. But at least the American commanders have had the sense to let the Governor-General begin the political process by himself.
They haven't lumbered him with dozens of American advisors and senior military personnel. He's being left alone. The Americans are also being very careful to keep most of their troops out of the capital. So the initial impression here is that the invasion has considerable support.
In November, Israel freed more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for just 6 Israeli soldiers being held in Tripoli in the Lebanon. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat was to take refuge in Tripoli after a rival Syrian-backed faction forced him out of the Palestinian camp at Badawi.
Arafat's fighters have been forced to retreat yet again, deep into pampas grass and palm trees not far from the sea. They pounded enemy positions high on the mountainside, but it soon became evident the target had been missed. It remains to be seen if Arafat really intends to die fighting alongside his men, or to try and escape before it's too late, to abandon Badawi just as he was forced to retreat yesterday from the other Palestinian camp nearby.
These places are to the Syrians, and there are some Libyan tanks shoot us with their guns.
Badawi may look empty, but Arafat would be deserting 45,000 Palestinian refugees hiding in the camp's bunkers, few of them daring to venture out during brief lulls in the heavy fighting. They look to him as the PLO leader, not Abu Musa, the rebel commander the Syrians want to install in Arafat's place. Some of the trapped Palestinians, though, fear Arafat's position is hopeless, so they've abandoned him to run the gauntlet of shells and to make their escape. The fighting has now spilled over into Tripoli itself. The PLO's war has brought terror once again to the doorsteps of the Lebanese. With the oil refinery ablaze and fuel running out, PLO guerrillas have taken over petrol stations at gunpoint to ensure their own supplies. There's much panic in the streets, though some Palestinian refugees have managed to walk to safety. While Yasser Arafat contemplates his only escape route left, from Tripoli, probably by Egyptian boat with safe passage past Israeli gunboats, to ignominious exile in Tunisia.
A rather more tranquil setting in a very different part of Africa, Kenya. The Queen returned to treetops, where she was first told of her father's death.
The Queen was escorted by an armed hunter as she returned to the game lodge, which made world headlines in 1952. On the night her father died, she'd been watching elephants and rhino. Today, gentler creatures came to stare, and the baboons got on with afternoon drinking and relaxing. There must have been memories, but nothing sentimental was in evidence. Just a 30-pound cake which took 2 weeks to create and a certain amount of time to deal with. The press were having a spot of buffalo bother. An obstinate middle-aged specimen was patrolling the press barrier. Led by an intrepid hunter, Fleet Street's wildlife approached with unusual caution and eventually gained ground. With much more aplomb, the Queen approached, walking to the very place where she'd been in the original treetops when she became Queen. It was a day for remembering, and in the end, even the buffalo gave in to the mood.
Yasser Arafat and 4,000 of his followers were forced to evacuate from Tripoli after they were surrounded by the Syrian army and rebel Palestinian guerrillas.
There were emotional farewells from men who had been fighting together for many months. Now they're being dispersed to the 3 countries which have offered them a haven: Algeria, Tunisia, and North Yemen. Amazingly, one of the PLO men being evacuated today was British, 26-year-old Ian Davison from South Shields. A supporter of the Palestinian cause, he came to Lebanon to fight alongside Yasser Arafat.
Well, it's more the people, you know. I was in Damascus for 4 months and I worked with Palestinian people, and it's just, you just take so much to the people. It's just natural to fight for them after you've lived.
In Tripoli's port, preparations were being made for the arrival of the Greek ships. After the Israeli attack yesterday, there were precautions to make sure the harbour had not been mined. Suddenly, fighter planes appeared in the sky. They were believed to be Israeli jets on a reconnaissance flight, and the Palestinians opened fire, without apparently hitting any of them. Soon after, the Greek ships sailed into Tripoli harbour, one after the other until all 5 were tied up. Then came a steady stream of vehicles carrying the departing Palestinians. The trucks were laden with suitcases.
This is a part of this long march to our independent states, to our capital, Palestine, Jerusalem.
But despite Yasser Arafat's pledge to hand over his heavy weapons to the Lebanese army, some lorries were packed with artillery parts and shells. 4,000 of Arafat's men were being evacuated, and the port was soon jammed with traffic. The scenes became increasingly chaotic, but amid the noise and confusion, some found time for prayer. The PLO regard this evacuation as a temporary setback and not a defeat. They say their armed struggle will go on elsewhere. And the Israeli government has already warned that this operation will simply give new life to a deadly terrorist gang. And as they boarded their ships, the PLO men fired hundreds of bullets and rocket-propelled grenades into the air, a traditional Palestinian farewell. But it was a moment of sadness for the families left behind. Finally, Yasser Arafat's car appeared and was promptly mobbed. But the PLO leader did not emerge, and after he disappeared on board, the ships quickly left the port to rejoin their French naval escort.
In Argentina, Raúl Alfonsín became president, heralding the country's return to democracy after 8 years of military rule. Britain immediately reinstated diplomatic links, frozen since the Falklands War.
People seem to have turned to the radicals, not just because they're a moderate party, but because they aren't internally divided like their opponents. There'll be immense problems ahead, particularly in the economy. But the radicals' leader, Raúl Alfonsín, has fought an intelligent and highly effective campaign, and that kind of leadership hasn't been shown here for more than a decade. Politically, Alfonsín is closest to Western European social democratic parties, though his followers are often more conservative. For the Peronists' leader, the moderate Italo Luder, it's a personal disaster, and his party, with its extremists of both left and right, and its hold on the unions, will have to decide whether to fight the new government or accept the verdict of the ballot box.
What had proved to be one of the royal family's busiest years ended with a curtain call from Prince William, now no longer a baby, but quite grown up, all of 18 months. As reporters and photographers gathered in the gardens at Kensington Palace, the prince appeared quite unabashed.
He even managed to smile.
Aren't we funny?
There was another moment's hesitation, and then the prince relaxed again and seemed to be ready for a chat. The princess kept a close eye on him, and when he suddenly decided enough was enough and made a dash for it, his father was quick to head him off. But the young prince was clearly still not too happy about his royal duties. The prince and princess did their best to cheer him up and turn his attention back to the cameras.
Well, there you go. There you go.
But at last the press was satisfied, and the prince could go back to being just William.
And so ends 1983, one of a series of cassettes produced by Newsbrief International and available for each year from 1970 onward to the present. From me, Peter Woods, for now, goodbye.